Well, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. I'm sure more will join as we get going here. There's Mary Panzer. I'll let you in, Mary Ellen Gilligan. Um, I want to welcome Craig Gilbert today. We're just so pleased to have Craig with us. Craig and I were colleagues at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel for a number of years and worked together a little bit on politics. I was usually on the opinion side, so that we didn't really work directly with one another, but a great deal of respect for Craig and his work. He's been at Marquette now for a number of years as a fellow at the Lubar Center. He is the former Washington bureau chief and national political reporter for the Journal Sentinel. He's covered every presidential campaign since 1988 and has been the reporter probably most responsible for chronicling Wisconsin's role as an enduring political battleground. He's written extensively about the battle for swing states in the upper Midwest, the region's shifting political map, and its increasingly polarized political culture. He's been recognized for his work by editor and publisher, the National Press Foundation, and the Columbia Journalism Review, which called him the most political science-friendly reporter in the country. He's been a Knight Wallace Fellow at University of Michigan, a writer in residence at University of Wisconsin, and as I mentioned, is a current and past fellow at the Lubar Center. Craig, welcome. So glad to have you.
Great to be with you, and this is a great audience.
Yeah, we got a good group here. So I want to start with just having you chat a little bit about the changing electorate in Wisconsin. Um, you wrote a piece back when President Carter passed away that reflected on 1976. And we were chatting earlier, 1976, I was 19 years old and I covered my first political event. It was Walter Mondale doing a whistle stop in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And things were really different in so many ways then. Talk a little bit about how Wisconsin has evolved, not just over that time, but even over the last 8 years.
Sure. I mean, I think knowing some of the people on this call, none of this is going to be news to many of you, but a lot of partisan realignment, which is happening internationally. It's happening across the country, and it's certainly happening in Wisconsin. I mean, the great enigma about Wisconsin is that it's remained so competitive and on such a knife edge, despite all this tremendous change within the state. Obviously, the growth of the urban-rural divide, the growth of the education divide, and you see that in the map. You see a lot of more rural parts of the state that are a lot redder than they used to be, and you see some what once very Republican suburbs getting less Republican. And you even are seeing some changes among urban voters, which we saw in this last election across the country, and to a modest degree in Wisconsin, where Donald Trump made some gains with, particularly with Hispanic voters, marginal gains with Black voters. But the consequences of all this are really interesting. I mean, we can talk about the causes. That's a complicated discussion. But when you look at the consequences, there are many. I mean, one is just that there are fewer purple places in a state like Wisconsin. When you talked about the Carter piece, one thing that blew my mind when I was looking at that, there were something like 30 states in the Carter election of 1976 that were decided by single digits, and there were something like 17 states that were decided by 5 points or less. And that just blows your mind when you think about the fact that there are so few states that are even contested now in presidential elections. And then within the state, I can't remember the exact numbers, but there were, huge numbers of counties that were also very purple and that were decided by single digits, by 2 or 3 points, by 4 or 5 points. And again, that doesn't happen nearly to the same degree anymore. So you see this kind of growth of political segregation in the state. You see the growth of kind of politically one-sided communities. Which has happened around Wisconsin. That has implications for legislative elections. It definitely disadvantages Democrats in district level elections because their voters are more concentrated in metropolitan areas. At the same time, if you in Wisconsin, it's I think it's created some challenges for the Republican Party in statewide elections. What we've seen since in the Trump era, in the elections post 2016, is that there have been no the ceiling of performance for Republicans has been about has been they've won a handful of elections by at most 1 point. The judicial election that Brian Hagedorn won in 2019, the Senate election that Ron Johnson won in 2022, and then the presidential election that Donald Trump won in 2024 were all won by the narrowest of margins. And on the other side, Democrats have had some narrow wins, but they've also had some sizable wins. So it seems like the decline of Republican support in the more densely populated areas has kind of lowered their ceiling and given them a narrower margin of error. Still absolutely able to win elections, but we haven't seen the kind of decisive victories that we saw for Scott Walker in his races for governor and some other races before that. And then finally, we can talk. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the court race, but one other consequence of this realignment has been that it used to be the Democrats expected to perform better in presidential elections because that was when the turnout was kind of maximal. And Republicans appeared to have an advantage in lower turnout elections because their voters, they tended to do really well in the college-educated suburbs, and those and older college-educated voters, wealthier voters, those people were the most reliable voters. And now this is kind of flipped around for some of the reasons we've been talking about. And if you look at 3 of the last 4 court races, which are lower turnout races in the spring, Democrat, the liberal, quote, Democratic candidate won 3 of those 4 races by double digits. And this is what's going to be interesting about this new court race is whether Republicans can equalize the playing field in a lower turnout election and just how high that turnout's going to be. But I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, just a reminder to everyone, please mute if you're not speaking. That would be helpful. So Craig, Charles Franklin compiled some data recently that showed that over the past decade, party ID had shifted in Wisconsin from about a 6-point Democratic advantage to a 3 or 4-point Republican advantage. And so that's that's change that's happened fairly quickly. That sounds like pretty good news.